Okay, so today I'm going to talk a little bit about some modelling at Ernest, basically looking at predictive modelling for potential targets within the mine and near mine. But before I talk about that, I think what I really should do is introduce it by talking a little bit of geomechanics and also covering some of the data that Rick probably went through yesterday, so you guys understand what the data actually means, because I'm sure that you want to start using it for exploration. So for the people that haven't seen this before, this is a very simple slide looking at the normal sort of methodology that you go through in terms of exploration within areas that particularly under cover, where you'll look at a structural interpretation from the geophysical data, you'll develop some conceptual ideas, do some prospectivity analysis by combining your data sets, and then making some decisions about where do we drill next. Well, what the geomechanics does is it actually allows you to test how that strain is partitioned within the crust during the deformation events and how to actually localize targets from that. And the normal process is to develop that regional interpretation that you normally do from your geophysical data, build a conceptual model, and then test that by deforming it, whether it's stress or deformation, and then look at these outputs and start looking at the areas that start to shine. And what we've done is develop what we call a predictor map. So you get to see what areas of the crust are more likely to deform in certain styles. And from that, you can use field validation to go out and actually look at these anomalies in the field. And we can do this in 3D as well, slightly different process. Essentially the same ideas. You're basically looking at structural interpretations from your geophysical and drilling data, build the 3D model, and again look at how the stress and strain localization is generated during the model. And then you can move closer scale like mine and near mine exploration and use very similar process and start to pick out areas where we see localization of strain and fluid focusing within the system. And if you're looking for a structurally controlled deposit or structurally controlled mineralization, then it's really a no-brainer to think about this. So we know that rock deformation is very important. It helps localize fluids within the crust, and really if we think about how to develop this so we can use it for targeting, obviously we need to think about processes like the law of effective stress, so how stress is involved in localizing fluids during deformation of the crust. And going back to, deformation 101, we need to think about the material that we're deforming, how it responds to that deformation, and what people think when they talk about dilatancy within the crust and how dilatancy actually attracts fluids. So what we're generally interested in is that, unrecoverable strain that we see in the rocks, that we measure in the rocks. So we're looking at the plastic deformation part, the elastic plastic deformation cycle. And on the right, there's a diagram here it's a really old diagram from Edmund and Patterson. And it basically explains that at different confining pressures and at different periods of axial strain within the material, we can start to see how that volume change takes effect. So essentially, when we're looking for dilation in the crust in areas that are going to focus these fluids that are of importance, we need to think about, as that strain continues, what section of that we're interested in terms of how that volume change takes effect. So we basically want to make sure that we start to find areas that are above that zero line. So from that contraction to dilation change. So we can think about deformation in terms of plastic, elastic and plastic. So as I said, we're really interested in that unrecoverable deformation. So that part where we reach that critical stress point. And when we think about stress in geology, this is just, some ideas on the three-dimensional component. So if we take the top surface of that cube, or volume cube, we can break that into simply normal and shear stresses. And as geologists, if we take the normal stress, for example, we simplify that into Cartesian coordinates. And this is generally what we speak about when we think about stress as sigma 1, sigma 2, and sigma 3. So once we understand how we can use the stress, we can think about it, in a graphical sense by using Mohr circles. And the reason I'm talking about this is that data set that Rick was talking about yesterday There's a bunch of data in there that relate to sigma 3, differential stress, pore fluid pressure required for failure. And if you don't understand these basics, then the data doesn't really mean much to you. So if we take normal stress on the x-axis and shear stress on the y-axis, and we start with some arbitrary condition where we've got maximum principal stress and minimum principal stress. Then there's a couple of ways we can get the fault to fail. One of the easiest ways is to actually increase that differential stress between sigma 1 and sigma 3. So if we increase the differential stress, we end up with, for example, the green circle. And where it touches this part of failure in the block, we'd expect to see failure in the block. The other way to do it is instead of increasing the differential stress, we can actually increase fluid pressure within the system. So we can pump fluids from below, increase that pressure, we shift that Mohr circle to the left until it touches the failure in the block. So that's two ways of getting rocks to fail and get fluids to focus within these rocks. And as you see, the colours relate to the styles of failure you would expect. So now, understanding the basics of this, you can then look at that data set and actually use the data in a relatively knowledgeable way. I guess that the process that's went through to get that data set is to develop some conceptual modelling. As Nick said, the architecture is actually very, very important. So you need to ask a lot of questions before you start building models. We develop I guess, a triangulated mesh, and every element within that mesh contains a bunch of information, and then we deform it, and then we can look at the outputs. In 3D, it's slightly different. We use a slightly different technique, but essentially it's the same. There's a bunch of information held in the mesh, and the mesh is deformed, and then we can look at the geomechanical outputs. So 2D stuff that I'm going to talk about is based on discrete processes. So it takes the material, or the rock material within the model is deformable, but it also really concentrates on the interface between these faults and lithological contacts. And the 3D is a continuum process. So faults, you'll actually find that they're more like shear zones. And they're both governed by, I guess, constitutive relationships. And Mohr is one that actually describes upper crustal rocks very well. So the data that Rick probably used yesterday was based on the Eastern Fault Belt, Mount Isa. We originally looked at 15 map sheets and then down to 6. And then we looked at local scale as well. And the aim was essentially just to try and identify on a regional scale areas that really focus localization of strain and were potential areas for tenement selection. And from that, we developed targets, and we went and we've done some field validation and more local scale mapping, and then run some more models at local scale. So these are sort of old-fashioned. They look a bit better nowadays, but essentially this is a bunch of targets based on, I think this is sigma 3, so low minimum principal stress, and there's a bunch of targets we picked out from there. So we want to have a closer look. And you can see here that the Selwyn High strain zone, Squirrel Hills granite Selwyn High strain zone sits in here, and you can see it's really prominent. So these are contours of sigma 3, and when we look at differential stress, sorry, it's on top, it's in red, we can see the Selwyn High strain zone basically sticks out like a sore thumb. However, we didn't want to concentrate in that area because most people know about it. There's a lot of exploration in that area. So we decided to try and go off the beaten track and find other areas that might be of interest. So this is a close-up. You can see that this is what we call fluid pressure required for failure, so contours of that. Essentially that's talking about that Mohr circle and how much fluid pressure you need to get that to fail. So the lowest values are obviously better than high. And we can see in the Selwyn High strain zone, it really picks the area out exceptionally well. And when we look at differential stress, we see there's a really good correlation with high levels of differential stress and low levels of PFF. So it would indicate that these things are very close, if not have underwent shear failure within the system. So one area that we thought we'd go and have a look at is an area called WEWAC. And we went there, we've done some field validation. We basically looked for the anomalies at the regional scale, and we walked over them, we've done a bunch of mapping. And then we undertook some geochemical sampling programs. Just before that, basically the contours here from the geomechanics, what we've done is we've actually produced these predictor diagrams. So Nick's done a bunch of work in iogas, And Rick's probably went through this yesterday, but essentially what we're trying to do is make the geomechanical stuff a bit more easy to deal with. So if we can pick out the areas that are more likely to fail in shear and tension, you can see these quite readily in the output variables. So this is a predictor diagram for this area. So Selwyn and WEWAC's up to the northwest. The red line is just an indicator where the old cover sequence 2 and 3 connects. On the right, or the center, sorry, is the PFF for that region. So we can see light blue is better than red. The Selwyn high strain zone, of course, sticks out, as does WEWAC. And on the right, it's basically zoomed in just to give you a look at the local area. So at the local scale, we've done a bunch of mapping. We've built another model to test, and we run the model. The black dots are geochemical results on the geochemical sampling program. And we can see straight away that there's a really good correlation between low values of PFF, which are blue, and on the right, we've got the associated predictor values. And where we get good geomechanical variables, we get really good return on the copper geochemistry. So the geomechanics is telling us something really important. It's telling us where the fluids are actually focusing within the crust. Just some field photographs showing you, where we find these things, we generally find that there's a change in behaviour of the rocks. So whether it's shear failure or tensile failure, we find that the anomalism actually tells us something quite important. So the whole process is, I guess, gather as much geological data as possible, build that conceptual model. You can use geomechanics to test that conceptual model and then provide these predictor maps. Obviously, when you've got predictor data, copper in your geochemistry, they're making really good first order targets. Before I go on to Ernest Henry, I just want to show you some modelling on the Mount Isa copper deposit. Again, using geomechanics to look at predictions and also to highlight targets. We thought that this might have been of interest, as well as looking at Ernest Henry. So I guess I don't have to explain much about Mount Isa copper. Most people in the room will know a lot about it. But essentially, the important relationship is obviously the Paru fault and that spatial association between the lead zinc and the copper ore. So there's a protracted deformation history, as well know, and I think that the D3 and D4 event have been events that people have postulated as being important for mineralization. So it was decided to look at the architecture and try and use geomechanics to see where the strain would localize, particularly along the Paru fault surface, as we know that's quite important. So the questions asked were, what are the most important structural features that control the mineralization? We decided the Paru fault was probably quite important, so that was something that we focused on. And what deformation event, D3 or D4, provides the best correlation with the mineralization that we see? And can we actually use this to predict additional zones? So we know D3 and D4 is important. There's obvious relationships in the mine that we can see both normal and reverse movement in here, but essentially we might see evidence of reactivation of D3 structures into D4, but we know these two, I guess, periods are quite important. Just as an offset, Ryan Long completed his PhD in 2010, and Ryan suggested that maybe it wasn't D3 and D4 that was important for Isa copper, that it might have actually happened during D2. And his evidence for this was to look at the shape of the Paru fault and the fact that the Paru fault actually bends around some of these copper ore bodies. That was the postulation for the things to be focused during D2 rather than later. Unfortunately, it's really difficult to test this because there's a lot of strain involved in D2. So what we decided to do was to look at D3 and D4, and is it plausible to get it to happen in later times? So the model was built in 3D. Essentially, top right-hand corner is the full block model. It contains the most important structures and units within the system. So we've got the basement rocks, the Paru fault, the Mount Isa fault, and obviously the Mount Isa group sediments. We also incorporated the Mount Isa fold here. So the geometry was quite complicated, but we thought the fold might have been important in terms of localization. He then converted this into a hexahedral mesh and started to deform it. So this is some of the results. This is the top left-hand corner is looking at shear strain rates during the early stages of D3. And what we see is that straight away on the Paru fault surface, we start to focus strain in particular locations. And when we look at the locations of where the ore is actually found, we see a really uncanny resemblance between where that strain is localized and where the deposit sits. Again, same using volumetric strain, which is essentially dilation. However, what you have to take note of is that at early stages, we're still not in the dilational part of the system. We're still in contraction. So it's something you need to be aware of. But as it progresses, we can start to see the shear strain rates focus really well on that size of surfaces of the ore bodies on top of there. And we can see that what the geomechanics is telling us is where the strain's focused is essentially where the ore sits. So it's telling us something very important. And you can see here, particularly with 1100, you can see how the strain's focused along that Paru fault system, and the ore bodies sit basically right above it. This spot up here is an area of dilation. So I had a closer look at this, and we can see that the fluid flow within that area is actually really strong. So that dilation in the system is actually focusing fluids into that area. So it's definitely a prime target to look at. This is looking at shear stress, but I probably want to concentrate on the top right. So the red surface is the Paru fault surface. The blue is the contact with the Spear Kennedy siltstone. And the orange blobs in the center here are actually isosurfaces of dilation from the model. And all the little light blue and dark blue lines are fluid flow vectors. And what you see is you start to see these things congregating and lining up in certain areas. And when we stick the ore on top of that, you can see why. So where this fluid flow, because the ore's not there during the model deformation, the ore's just been placed on top of the results. So that fluid focusing is actually really important. And it seems to point out exactly where the ore sits. And at the back near the Spear Kennedy siltstone, the fluid flow is very strong below these perched ore bodies. So it's saying that fluid's coming up through the system. So the results were very good correlations to the ore. And again, the Mount Isa Fall, we thought we'd have a closer look at, and we can see the yellow areas there are isosurfaces of dilation and sitting on a shear strain contour map. So very important to have a look at. During the southeast compression, the D4 event, the results were nowhere near as good in terms of correlation with the known ore. So what we think's happened is that we think that the majority of the preconditioning of the rocks and potentially fluids have come in during D3, and the D4 event we might have remobilized things at a very small scale. A bunch of targets obviously developed from a lot of this work, and yeah, some of them have shown quite encouraging results. So it gave them a really good understanding of the system. They understood what actually happened, how the strain focused, how the fluids were involved, and why the ore body sits where it does. And I think what it does is it helps increase that potential for discovery of further mineralization, hopefully to extend the current life of mine. Okay, probably close to time. You're right. Okay, Ernest Henry, copper gold. I'll blame Nick if I run out of time. I won't go through much of the background here. It's probably been covered quite well. So essentially we've got a large mineralized breccia system. Basically it sits between that deformed sequence of metavolcanics and metasedimentary rocks. We've got a large diorite body, and the initial discovery, I think there was no real sufficient geological indicators. Basically, a lot of the discovery was based on, I think, drilling and structural data and geophysics is the main avenue for discovery. We can see that there's a relationship between the proximal and distal parts of the ore body in terms of clast and matrix supported breccias. Nick's went through this. This is some work from Melanie Coward in 2001, just looking at the plan view of the pit and also cross sections. But we can see two of the most important structures in the mine are obviously the hanging wall and footwall shear zones. So the idea was to look at, I guess, new geophysical data that was gathered and do a regional interpretation in this, and then use that regional interpretation to try and zoom down to a local scale and think about how this thing might be, how it might look in 3 dimensions. And using the geophysical interp as well as the drilling data, we managed to build a 3D conceptual idea of the area. And it actually matched exceptionally well with the drilling data, so we were quite happy with how the model came out. We had to backstep it slightly because we were going to deform this thing, but we had a representative model we were happy to test. We were really interested in what happens on that hanging wall shear zone and how strain localizes and how it might be related to the deposit of the breccia. So there's a bunch of stuff done, I guess, in terms of exploration methodology prior to this project with limited success. And there was also some depth limitations due to infrastructure within the mine, so they decided to use some geomechanical modeling to try and assist with near mine exploration. I think now they're getting some drill drives down. So again, similar story with the regional deformation events. Decided to test D3 and D4 again. This is the 3D model, so it's a hexahedral model. We've got the main units of interest. The green's the large diorite body. We've got a bunch of stacked shear zones. And the breccia, the ore body sits basically between the hanging wall and footwall, and it's that little gold spot. Out on the right is just simply the same model with a bunch of units chopped away, and it's just for ease, so we can look at the visual results on the hanging wall shear. I'm only going to show you a snippet of these results, basically what's been shown before, and it's basically focused on the hanging wall shear zone. So at very early stages in D3, we can start to see that shear strain rates are split into two sort of southerly dipping trends. And as we progress through this model, this is just a transparent view to let you know where the breccia system sits in relation to that. We can see that this localization pretty much stays on these two trends within the system. So we see that high shear strain increments are focused up to the north, essentially where that diorite body turns. But again, we've got this one to the south, so it's like two legs that come down the shear zone. And we can look at that shear strain, and at later stages start to look at the volumetric strain or the dilation and see how volumes change within the system. And on the hanging wall shear, there's some obvious spots of where dilation takes place. And essentially, when we look at where the breccia body sits, it sits just behind where that dilation is most focused on the shear zone. If we look at fluid flow within the volcaniclastic unit, so this is essentially between the hanging wall and footwall shear, we can start to see that there's actually high levels of fluid flow pretty much where the breccia body sits in comparison to the rest of the unit. So the fluid flow is telling us something important. I think what's happening is it's starting to focus within that dilatant zone. Late stages in D4, so this D3 could be considered as potentially preconditioning these rocks or initiating the brecciation, and the D4 event could be that there's slight remobilization or getting fluids further into the system. And again, we see that maximum shear strain rate focused in a very similar area. Different contours, but similar area on the hanging wall shear. That's where the breccia body sits behind it. And we see during deformation as it's squeezed, this thing starts to congregate. And this is looking from basically the south, and you can see that the focus of that dilation on that shear zone sits very similar orientation to the body itself. So this is dilation again, and on the right, it's basically I've taken the units away and we're left with the footwall shear, and we can see that the relationship between the dilation on that footwall shear and where the breccia body sits is a very good correlation. Just quickly looking at potential failure within the system. So the green to the north is essentially shear failure, and the red and yellows have got tensile failure in them as well. And you can see a lot of the tensile failure at late stages start to happen around where that breccia body sits. So the geomechanics was telling us where we'd expect to find certain types of deformation within the rock. So I think the guys gained a really good understanding of why the breccia body sits where it does in terms of that inflection on the main structures, and also that composite contrast between the diorite body and the sediments and volcaniclastics. And I think what it's done is given them an alternate data set to look at, particularly if they want to look at targeting drilling within the system. As I said, I haven't showed you all the results. There's a bunch of stuff out with what I've showed you. But I think that, you know, outside conventional means, these things, these results can be used in terms of prediction for further ore. The last slide is based on some drilling they wanted to do further to the west. So there's a little satellite body called Erebus, and the current targeting was specifically focused on these areas of high fluid flow within the Erebus shear. And we can see we've got really strong fluid flow up the side of this, this known target. So I think what the modelling's done is it's actually showed that the fluid and strain localization actually picks out some of the known deposit or mineralization very well. So it provides exceptional targets to follow up for drilling. There is another few targets to the north and south of the deposit itself, but time will tell. Thank you.